So I'm going to give you a sort of a demonstration lecture of a course I do for the 3rd and 4th year students called Philosophy of Globalization. So it's a slightly contrived environment because obviously most of you don't have a background in some of the basic concepts I assume in the course, but I'll do my best to make it accessible and try and give you a taste of what it's about. While we wait for the technology to sort itself out, you probably are mostly familiar with the idea of a global village. Have you heard that sort of expression before, the global village? Does anyone know where that expression might originate from, the global village? The sense that we live in a global village and obviously are interacting with each other in a different way. So this is also the usual situation where silence and the people look down and avoid answering the question, and I have to go back to my learning techniques of how to teach quiet, shy students. Anyway, the global village I'll explain in a minute, but as I say, this is a course, Philosophy of Globalization, for the senior division, Japan and East Asia. It's open obviously to environmental sciences students too, and I'm just giving you the sort of introductory overview of the course that students get in the first week. So most courses here start with an introduction of some sort, just so the students can get a taste of what it's about, and usually they can shop around in the first 2 weeks and decide which courses to eventually settle and take. So I'll go through this notion of the global village and try and give you a very whistle-stop tour of some of the key ideas in globalization and hopefully nourish your minds for the lunch to come. So the global village is from this figure here on the right, Marshall McLuhan, who was one of the first sort of pop star academics. I'm not sure if there's many of them today still, but he was a Canadian academic who wrote a lot about the media, and you can see this quotation there, which is from 1967, which I should add is a really good year to be born in. And in 1967, that's 52 years ago, he wrote this, so it's kind of prophetic in some ways. And what you can see in his quote there is he's suggesting that through electric, so the language is a little bit different to what we use today, isn't it? But we can still make sense of what he's saying. This electric or internet technology, we've extended, he has the sense of our senses, smell, touch, thinking being extended through technologies. And so obviously as the globe becomes enveloped in these systems of technology, obviously our minds can then pick up, as we do all the time, information from servers across the globe. And his point here is that both space and time become conflated. So there's no longer obviously that need to wait for information to come through a newspaper that's printed in a very distant place. We have it instantaneously. What Marshall McLuhan also tells us about is that this new sense of a global village living in a single space and time carries risks. And he's predicted even then, 50 years ago, that those risks would be indifferent. So the more information we have, the more immune we come to it, and the more indifferent we become to another tragedy, another disaster, another. So that's what we also have, that sense of overload a little bit, but also what he called retribalization. People might lose their sense of identity in this global, rather uprooted world, and therefore retribalize. And again, I think we're seeing that quite a lot in contemporary politics in many countries, where there's a sense of people pushing back a little bit from these ideas of not knowing who they are, what their identity is. Indeed, many PEAK students have that sort of issue because a lot of them have bicultural backgrounds and come to Tokyo looking to find a sense of who they are. So a lot of these ideas here are very important. The global village, so what we see there, there's a dominant narrative, I think, in globalization about how it's somehow a force for good, a universal force. And when one resists it, you're often sort of portrayed as the local, the sort of reactionary, the anti-modern, the pre-modern, the medieval. This logic is very powerful today. It's picked up pace a lot post 9/11. And there's a sense in which globalization means primarily westernization. There's various books have been written that called it McDonaldization. There's a lot of writing to suggest that it's an American hegemony. Throughout the course, we show why that isn't the case, but also why there's a perception that it might be. But I want to keep moving along this track here. So globalization is somehow universal. Anyone who resists it somehow parochial, local. Is that really the case? And I want to use one example. And of course, you realize how dated things get. So this issue is from 2001, which I guess some of you were just being born or in the conceptual process of becoming, if you know what I mean. And so there were these famous Twin Towers attacks, which I'm sure you're at least aware of. And the idea was this was the first real wave of anti-globalization. It was striking at the heart of the beast, as it were, in the USA on its territory. It was seen targeted the Twin Towers, as you know, typically a symbol of economic globalization. And the point was to portray then Osama bin Laden, who you see here in this still from a video image, as the parochial Islamic, of course. All these other labels were attached to him, and also Al-Qaeda, as this very much parochial resistance to globalization. And of course we saw a whole mobilization of forces to resist that. So my question to you is, do you think that is true? Was Al-Qaeda and bin Laden in particular a sign of the parochial resisting the universal aspects of globalization? In particular, if you focus on that picture, what might suggest that isn't the case? What do you notice about his dress, what's around him, the actual image you see?
There's an AK-74 next to him.
There is, 47 I believe it is, but maybe I'm wrong, 74 or 47?
It's a 74.
I bow to your expertise. I won't know how. So how might that symbolize the universal rather than the parochial?
I think it's symbolizing fighting.
It does, but where does that come from originally, that weapon?
A Soviet soldier.
Oh, it's a Russian manufacturer, isn't it?
Yes.
So
Heard from.
yeah, so clearly this picture was taken from a still in apparently a cave that we was hiding out in somewhere in the mountains in Afghanistan. So to have got hold of that weapon, he would have had to do what? He couldn't go down to his local shop and buy it.
I heard in the internet that he killed a Russian soldier to get the AK-74.
He killed the Russian. Okay, there's obviously competing stories, and I don't want to dispute the internet. But maybe that particular one is the case. But his soldiers had several, of these rifles or machine guns, and the idea would be that they would have had to be in contact with Russian wholesalers, gun runners, to get this weapon to where they were hiding out. What else do you notice? Thank you very much.
Isn't it like broadcasting a message to, like?
It is. It was a message to the world. So what does that tell us about the way that message was sent, the medium of its?
To like some sort of language or communication that can be understood by other people in the world?
Okay, so he spoke in Arabic and there was translation. It was shown across the news in the US and other countries. But I'm thinking of the medium because he actually made that video and sent it to Al Jazeera. And obviously had to have couriers to get it there. And then Al Jazeera is a global TV network, isn't it? And that had to be able to distribute it. His watch, so it's rather a blurred picture, but the watch doesn't look like your regular corner store watch, does it? It's actually a Timex watch. So my point I'm trying to make here is what you see with bin Laden there is a whole lot of globalization factors that made his terrorist organization possible. In other words, it's very probably incorrect to say he's parochial. He's riding the wave of globalization, ironically, to resist it, if that's what in fact he was doing. So I'll need to change that to 74 to bow to your expertise. But so we have all these issues we've talked about. They're very much global features. So the conclusion we might reach here is that, as uncomfortable as it may sound, both the US hegemony in sort of cultural and military sphere, as well as Al-Qaeda, and perhaps we could, by analogy, extend that to the Taliban in Afghanistan, are both products of globalization. So it's not actually an easy thing to conceptualize. So how do we then go about thinking of globalization? Well, clearly it's multifaceted. It could be a process we're going through. It could be a condition, a place where we've arrived. Obviously, we have a sense of it as a system, something external to us that impacts upon us rather than us being agents of that process, hence the sense of being overwhelmed by it. But there's maybe three ways to think about it here. One is globalization as a process. So this is the sort of socioeconomic, and I've called it ethical, political. Socioeconomic, the changes in social networking, obviously the way we interact through technologies, the economic factors, world trade. The ethical I'll come back to later. The political, obviously, what would be one of the major issues of globalization and classic understandings of politics? Are there any students here who study government or politics? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Oh, well, this is kind of my guess, but isn't it kind of like the line blurs between like diplomatic relations? So like cultures are blurred rather than being distinct. Because of globalization, everything kind of becomes this one thing rather than like each distinct culture.
Yeah, so there is a blurring is the nice way you've put it. I suppose that's a cultural factor more than a political. Clearly there's politics behind that. But what about most of us are obliged to live in a thing called a nation state. And what is particular about a nation state, or a state in particular? What type of power does it have? What do we call it? You've probably got an idea twirling around inside your head, and usually your intuitions are correct, so the only thing that's stopping you giving me the right answer is your shyness. So the state has what type of power we talk about? Starts with an S. We used to use this word to describe single people who rule the state, but now we the people apparently do. A sovereign, yes, it's a sovereign power. So one of the ideas behind globalization is the sovereign power of the nation state is undermined, whether it's by transnational organizations like the UN or the attempt to actually take power up to a higher level in the European Union. But anyway, let's focus here on globalization, this process that has all these changes. It's dynamic. A lot of it's driven by technology. We might also then follow this definition by a Dutch writer who talks about globalization as this process of deterritorialization. So I think that word speaks for itself to some extent, but it's about ideas and power being lifted up from territory. So in the example of the nation state I gave, obviously one of the key definitions of a state and sovereign power is having absolute power over a clearly defined territory. So with deterritorialization, some of that sovereign power obviously is coming from outside. So for example, in Japan, they may have impositions on environmental regulations. They may have factors they have to follow in terms of production of agricultural products. Certainly in terms of manufacturing, they have to conform to international norms about safety and seatbelts and airbags in cars. So that's the idea of deterritorialization we have there and this process. We also need to think about globalization maybe as a condition, as a contemporary space, a contemporary, to use the word I used earlier, existential set of factors that we have to deal with. And here it's about this sense of this much closer global village, which I've mentioned a little bit before. And the point to emphasize here obviously is it's not a condition we all have to get to and experience in the same way. You may be familiar with the Japanese-American writer Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a well-known text 20-odd years ago at the fall of the Berlin Wall called The End of History. And his argument was that the whole world, that sort of history had ended and we were all heading towards a kind of a liberal, democratic, capitalist type of system. So the point I emphasize there, and many writers today, is to suggest that obviously this condition doesn't all have to be homogenizing. It can obviously be experienced in very different ways. So we can almost talk about a Chinese approach to globalization, certainly an American, no doubt a European, which juxtaposes itself a little bit, certainly a Japanese, a Latin American, and even an African, to use these very broad civilizational categories. Just in terms of time, I'll jump ahead a little bit. So we've got a process, something that's going on, a condition that some of us are experiencing. And finally, this notion of a global imaginary, the sense that we're all sitting here, obviously with our bodies very much anchored to the ground, but our minds, through the extension of social networks, access to real-time news, obviously friends, family, cousins, aunts, uncles, living in other places who are sending you message, who you speak to through Skype and other types of media. This gives you the sense of this global imaginary. So coming back to your point earlier about a blurring, there's a sense here of belonging that's very important. We sort of cajoled a little bit into belonging to something beyond ourselves, beyond the nation state, but that isn't always a very profound and deep sense of who we are. So a lot of us still prefer to feel much more secure and safe in that belonging to being Japanese or American or South African in my case. So clearly this is liberating. It's great to be released from the shackles of some of these more dominant types of identity that force you to stand up and sing this or wear a certain type of dress. Clearly, we don't always want to have to do that. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily replace it in a properly meaningful sense. So again, that's what a lot of globalization scholars are trying to think through. And this is what I was referring to earlier about the ethical challenge. There's no point probably trying to resist globalization. The point is how to learn to live ethically and coexist for all sorts of reasons, obviously just to live, but because the resources are scarce, environmental problems don't stop at borders, and obviously economic distribution and wealth and political solutions to how we distribute clearly need to be done beyond simple and traditional nation-state borders. So this is the notion of the imaginary. As I've said, we're sort of very much anchored but connected through these technologies to the world beyond our simple everyday selves and lives. It's interesting to look then at how these issues clash out. This is just a survey that was taken about, it's very basic, globalization, good or bad. And it's curious to notice that the countries that believe it's a force for good, Southeast Asian nations by and large, not only, India as well, tend to view it more positively as these countries where arguably it's been around for a little bit longer. So I suppose there's a sense here in which this process, this imagination and this condition are being played out in different ways here. I just put that there as a little bit of food for thought. But let's move to some of the debates that take place. So we've seen that globalization is a process. It's something that's happening whether we like it or not. It does lead to a certain condition. So I mean, this is a classic condition, isn't it? I would guess at a rough estimate there's 20, 30 different nationalities here. In Japan, most of you probably are not having something directly to do with Japan. You've come a long way. How? Through plane travel at relatively low cost. And you're thinking of going to this university or some other university, probably outside your country of origin, residence, how do we phrase it? The place you happen to be at the moment at school. So we have this condition, and this is a nice example, as I say, and we also have this consciousness. I suppose PEAK, for that matter, would be a way of installing and promoting and playing off that consciousness, that global imaginary. And indeed, most of the classrooms are very interactive. Students providing answers to these questions, for example, what is globalization, from a huge array of perspectives in all the different countries they've come from, which is extremely rewarding and challenging for the students, but it also makes the conceptual understanding of it problematic because you never get a clear, straight answer, but that probably is a good thing. So one controversy is what are the key dimensions of globalization? What powers it? I mean, who are the winners and losers? How do we try and understand cause and effect? What to do in relation to it? And a lot of the literature suggests that it's a bit like that famous parable of the blind scholars trying to figure out what is this thing they're touching, the elephant, and obviously those who touch on the leg claim it's something like a pillar. Those who feel the tail claim it's a rope. But what is the parable trying to tell us? It's about seeing, and obviously what we know often comes from seeing. Certainly in the Western tradition, a lot of our knowledge is about objectivity, the eye. So what is this telling us when we're trying to have a big vision of globalization and we have this elephant and...
Depending on your perspective, it's very different.
Yeah, so exactly, precisely. So, and what would the argument be? That what we need to get beyond that perspective is to have a larger picture. To see the elephant and not just the single part of the anatomy that each individual scholar feels. So that's exactly it. And I suppose in globalization we have all these different perspectives, the economic, the political, the cultural, the ideological, the environmental, the social. And throughout the course I try and focus on one or two of the aspects, but of course the trick is to try and hold them all together and conceptualize globalization from all these multiple perspectives. Far from an easy thing to do, but that is the purpose of that course. And I suppose a lot of the knowledge that we produce in universities is trying to give us not just a singular, but rather a broader, not necessarily objective, but just a broader perspective on things, which simply makes holding beliefs as truths and therefore wanting to die for them are much less easy, which I think is probably, again, a good thing. Once you relativize your beliefs and I suppose coexistence, coming back to the challenge of globalization, is that much more possible. So another way of perceiving this would be then in terms of perhaps a system. So I suppose a lot of the writers in globalization now think of a worldwide global capitalist system. This is something, those of you who've done economics or perhaps politics or even sociology, it goes back a long way to the famous quote by Karl Marx and Engels in 1850 about the world becoming a smaller place as capitalism spreads itself through colonization. That process is very old, and certainly today I think most of us understand what it means to have a system that is economically integrated. You probably all have an iPhone of sorts. I mean, do I need to explain more about what I mean by a global system of large multinational corporations? We also have network, a way to perceive this as a network. Again, that's the idea of the technology, which is very important to understanding globalization as somehow a specifically new phenomenon post-1980s. Linked to information and communication technologies. But also this mosaic is also a nice way to think of it, which is suggesting that we have senses of identification and belonging which are no longer nation-state bound, but in this mosaic formation. And obviously these mosaics aren't compartmentalized, they do overlap, just like many of you may have lived in different countries or have parents from different backgrounds and linguistic repertoires. So to summarize, what I'm trying to do in this course is look at the conceptualization of it, have that larger perspective, not simply the singular. Think about the causality. So for some writers, it's, globalization is simply capitalism, but it's probably more than that, isn't it? It's simply about the technology, and a lot of the very proactive writers around globalization will talk about how technologies just needs to be spread and diffused, and problems of inequality will disappear in the long run. There's also this periodization. It's very important, again, to understanding these 2 points. Is it something new? Is it something old? I mean, globalization in one sense is an understanding of the world, and the concept world goes back again in the Western tradition, which I'm limited to. In the Greek tradition, the Greeks thought they lived in the world, the cosmos, and for them it was essentially Athens and a few other places around it. So if you think of the world as expanding, and obviously today being global, then you could argue it's been around for over 2,500 years. But if you focus on the technology, then globalization obviously is something much more recent. Why do we need to focus on it as recent? Obviously there are lots of political, economic stakes that we do so. A very important part is the impact, the environmental, the political, weak, strong states, how they cooperate, the strong state players, the issues of distribution. We've had a lot of issue in the last couple of weeks about selling and redistributing plastic waste. Japan, in fact, has been prevented from sending its plastic waste initially to China for recycling, and now recently in Thailand they've refused it too. So suddenly the Japanese government is thinking about having to rethink its policy on plastic waste. And one of them is, if you have the chance, you might go to Lawson or one of the convenience stores where you can buy an onigiri, and notoriously it has that little wrapping, lots of plastic. And the government has suggested they will stop that plastic wrapping from next year. Bear in mind that Lawson alone sells 2.2 billion onigiri a year. So we're talking a lot of plastic. But what they'll do as the alternative, I don't know. But it's a good example of an impact. And finally, the challenge. I think the challenge of globalization, as I say, is it's there, it's not going away. It's probably also potentially a very good thing. And it requires, therefore, coexistence. And we can't always look to the political for that coexistence to come about. So I think it's much more an ethical challenge, how we ourselves approach this challenge, whether it's obviously making onigiri at home and not using the plastic, whether it's doing an international program which has a huge carbon footprint as you go back to visit your parents every end of semester, but obviously also the types of job you might like to get involved in, the companies, and how you might shape an ethical policy in a corporate and NGO environment. So that is the sort of questions I look at in the course. And just to finish off with, these are some of the authors I look at and some of the themes. I just show this because they are quite a wide variety. So we have A Dutch writer, Scholte. We have two writers here. The second one's Micklethwaite and Wooldridge, who are writers for The Economist. You may have come across The Economist journal magazine. We have Wallerstein, who's an American academic, and Stiglitz, who was a World Bank economist, a Nobel Prize winner. We have a British academic, David Held, again, another famous American academic, Huntington, and then Appadurai is I don't know if we call him an Indian academic based in the US, talking about the cultural aspect, the blurring you spoke of earlier, is hybridity. We have a French philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, who talks about the world of simulation and globalization as a simulation to hide power relations. I also look at Zygmunt Bauman, who died last year, a Polish sociologist, who talks about globalization in terms of a consumerist logic. And the last couple, we have Michael Hart, who's an American academic who's teamed up with an Italian writer, Antonio Negri, to talk about globalization in terms of a new empire. The empire strikes back a little bit. And Anne-Laure Stoller, she's a writer who works at the New School in New York, talks about duress, the continuation into the present world of colonial legacies. And the system I did this week, and I'll be finishing the course next week, is another French writer who talks from a French perspective about contrasting this world mondialisation, which is the French word for globalization, how it means different things. And finally, the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, who talks about globalization as a crystal palace, which is a lovely metaphor, suggesting obviously we're all inside the crystal palace, but crystal is notoriously fragile, and hence the need for the ethical care in this approach. So that's a very short whistle-stop tour of the course I do, and hopefully in the years to come, I'll still be here, but you'll be here too, and we can get back together to do that. So thanks very much.